keeping you up. But welcome to any night owls who can't sleep. I hope this show will be relatively relaxing, although it probably won't be. Talking about the outcome of the Derek Chauvin trial, where he was found guilty on all three counts. Tucker Carlson's strange, nervous laugh and cutting off of a guest, a former police officer who was condemning the excessive violence used by Derek Chauvin. And I want to talk about ways of defeating misanthropic politicians. So to define the word misanthropic, it means hateful towards people. And there's some misanthropy in the world, and I think we should talk about its origins, namely that even some people on the left have very hostile feelings towards human beings because they have been falsely taught that the way to solve environmental problems is to just get rid of people. And there's not a direct one-to-one correlation between the number of people and the amount of human-caused environmental problems. It's actually a policy problem, and it tends to come with a baked-in set of racist assumptions in that people who are big advocates for population control often tend to talk about population in continents and countries populated by predominantly black and brown skinned people. So there's been an intersection there of somewhat irrational hatred towards human beings and irrational hatred towards people of color, which is a bad combination. And that can put people off the environmental movement. And more importantly, it can block people's ability to actually look for solutions. Because if you've created this false idea that the solution is just less people, then you're not going to make much progress with the real problem, which is bad ideas and bad policy. Not at all commensurate with just the number of people, because there's plenty of high population countries that don't consume resources or generate pollution or damage biodiversity levels in the same way that other populations do. So to just smooth over the differences between people hampers our ability to actually identify the problematic actions and choices and ideas. Knowledge El Shabazz is with us and says hello from Lynchburg. Hello, Knowledge. Nice to see you. Hope you're well. Now, somebody I follow on Twitter pointed out that people don't tend to have very much success trying to rescue their family members from conspiracy and Trumpism by just telling them facts. Facts feel like raindrops bouncing off an umbrella sometimes when you're trying to address what seems like a compulsive addiction to untruth. And they said we Democrats should be availing themselves of the power of story. When you have an explanation that resonates with people, because we hook facts onto a story that we tell ourselves. So if they've become hooked into a fake story that Trump is a superhero rescuing children from Hollywood and Democrats, and that Republicans aren't the ones who assault children, that's wrong. It's not supported by facts. It makes them deviate more and more from verifiable reality and live in an extremely made up, fantastical world in which they're always expecting arrests, but they're still always primed to get new revelations from Q or from the Q communities now that Q has gone silent because Joe Biden became president, and he's not a hologram or a puppet figure while Trump is really ruling the country from Mar-a-Lago. Trump is clearly on holiday, just basking in the adulation of the people who pay $200,000 for membership of the Mar-a-Lago club. He's not ruling the country, and I guess time makes that more obvious to people. The rest of us are still kind of warily waiting to see what kind of justice unfolds in relation to prosecuting the people who helped conscript people to the cause of overthrowing an attempted overthrow of the government, namely the insurrection, the sacking of the capital on January the 6th, justice matters, etc., etc. There's a lot of people waiting on that. But in the meantime, there's a lot of other people who are just relaxing into sane governing that addresses the needs of the people and doesn't govern with the fascist style of made-up stories and made-up villains, all organized to befuddle and confuse Republican loyal people who watch Republican conservative media and derive this alternative set of facts and this alternative story about how the world works and what's happening in the world. Very little of which bears a relationship with the truth. So in Trump conservative world, climate change isn't real, Republicans aren't guilty of sex trafficking, etc. So the story that we need to be telling these people is cool because it is a conspiracy story, but it's true. And perhaps if you tell it to them and they find it persuasive because maybe their brain is still capable of resenting billionaires. The true story is there's a billionaire conspiracy amongst people like Rupert Murdoch and the Koch brothers, well, the alive Koch brother still, and other billionaires who have worked to establish a media machine and who work to pervert political processes in America in order to gain tax cuts for themselves. So they lie to their audiences in order to compel them to vote for politicians who will do nothing for the public other than usher in tax cuts for very wealthy people, including billionaires. And they will put time-limited tax cuts for the middle class, but in perpetuity, the tax cuts for the wealthy remain as long as Republicans stay in power, using their energy to protect those tax cuts and defeat anything else that Democrats have to offer that would improve life for Americans, namely working Americans who are still struggling. Struggling families is apparently the catchy phrase that you can use that helps more people buy into what is needed. I'm beginning to think, Christopher Lucas, that it's an automatic process and that maybe you're blocked in some way from the channel or you're marked from the channel. So when, instead of trying to figure out if I have any moderators who are hiding your comments, I'll ask the HAPS organizers when I see them. Sometimes they drop into the broadcast and they say hi and make an appreciate award. If you see them stop in and their comment is marked saying HAPS team, and then yes, let me know, because I will ask them, what do I do if I have a loyal regular audience member whose comments are perpetually marked as muted by a moderator? You're welcome. And good to know that you're doing well, Knowledge. I love your name, so excuse me for laughing when I say it, but it just sounds like I'm revering knowledge, which I also do. All right, let's have a look. Joy Ann Reid made an important speech about the outcome of the George Floyd trial, and I wanted to share that with you a little bit. She's talking about how, yes, it's not justice to celebrate per se, because it can't restore the stolen life of George Floyd. And it is, however, a measure of justice that can have a ripple effect that can radiate out through the American justice system, because it's drawn a line to say, nope, American society has reached a point now where at least it's been said by jurors. You can no longer be guaranteed that amongst white jurors that some of them will gum up the works and say, no, can't convict a white police officer of a crime. Like, nope, people are prepared now. They accept more. And there's there's greater mechanisms to deliver evidence as well. So I'll listen to what she has to say.
Think about how rare it is for a police officer to be convicted of killing a Black man, woman, or child in America. For this family, they have achieved something almost revolutionary. Yeah. They have not only been able to get justice for themselves, which isn't going to ease their pain. They don't have their brother, their family member, their loved one. He's gone. But they've achieved justice that is going to radiate potentially throughout our system. Because the defense that was put on for Derek Chauvin was the same defense that was put on in the Rodney King case. He had superhuman strength. He was on drugs. Therefore, he was going to get up, really rise from the dead, because he was dead for about 3 minutes of Derek Chauvin having his knee and his full body weight on him. That he was going to rise from the dead and still be a threat. The Black man is always a threat. The Black body is a threat. He tried everything. He was on drugs. He was, the real culprit in his own death. And that didn't work. And so I think what's happened is that we've established a line that was drawn by police, a line that was drawn in the criminal justice system. That you just can't kill a man in front of witnesses, including a 9-year-old, on video camera and walk away from it. I think it's important that we draw that line because law enforcement is losing the consent of the governed. They're losing credibility with the American people, particularly in communities of color. This needed to go this way, in a way, just for our society to be able to take a step forward.
I thought it was interesting, too, after the verdict was announced, seeing different locations and people's reaction. It wasn't celebration or people jump. It was just people going and just taking a beat. And that was like, wow, that was powerful.
Yeah, there's nothing to celebrate when someone goes to prison, right? This man's life is over, Derek Chauvin. He made a decision and he had 9 minutes and 29 seconds to change his mind and make a different choice. The decision he made is the end of his career. It's the end maybe of his freedom for the rest of his life. We don't know what kind of a sentence he's going to get. He has tainted law enforcement. He has embarrassed and shamed his department. And that was what the testimony was, that this was an embarrassment to what law enforcement is supposed to be. Law enforcement people that I know were embarrassed by what he did. He shamed himself and he's lost his freedom. There's nothing to celebrate. But I do think that for the family, it's a relief, right? I mean, there were people who were interviewed by Shaq Brewster, who's our reporter on the ground, who said, I can breathe now. People can stop holding their breath. And I think just for a moment, we can acknowledge that it is a relief. It isn't anything to be joyful about.
Joy, thank you so much for coming.
All right. That was Joy-Ann Reid. It's interesting. Derek Chauvin reduced the credibility of the police, not only to Black people, but in this instance, to white people as well. So for too long, it's been a reality that Black people were prepared to acknowledge that there were police who behaved in a way that shocks the conscience, who behaves in a way that is not merited by circumstances. And that was a knowledge gained by people who were paying attention. But the difference with the Derek Chauvin case is that compelled our attention because it had 9 minutes of sustained footage in which you cannot easily make excuses. You cannot easily pretend, oh, well, what happened when we weren't looking? We were looking for that whole 9 minutes of that man's knee on that man's neck. And that credibility cannot be regained. But it's important to lose it because it means there is less of a pass now for police officers to act with impunity, knowing they have the consent of the white majority, the consent of the governed to act in whatever way, shape, or form they see fit, to give vent to the worst impulses of human nature. And I think the impulse that compelled Derek Chauvin was a racist form of stubbornness, that he had no respect for George Floyd's life, and yet the crowd was begging him to deal respectfully with George Floyd and to stop putting his life in danger and to resuscitate him after he had lost consciousness, to take care of his life. And Derek Chauvin was saying, no, you can't tell me what to do. I'm a white man. So if I feel like brutalizing, humiliating, punishing a Black man, I will continue to do so. So he could have stopped before George Floyd was dead, and he still would have completely violated the human rights and the human dignity of George Floyd, because he's a racist who delights in subjugating and tormenting a black man. But he kept it up more so because of the challenge of the crowd, I'm concluding. I heard somebody suggest that yes, there was a perverse motive driving Chauvin in defiance of the crowd. So that defiance is a microcosm of the defiance writ large of white supremacists, noting the demographic changes of the United States, that there are more people of color, not only living in the United States, but flourishing in the United States and demanding diversity in workplaces and seeking to end some of the white nepotism that functions in workplaces and as guardians and gatekeepers of the good jobs that attract the massive under-acknowledged government subsidies, whereby your corporate healthcare associated with your good job is funded through 100% tax credits. And that is a massive part of America's finances. America's budget is that good jobs, which are still predominantly held by white people, and black people are still disproportionately and unfairly turned away from those jobs or have their applications ignored, that is being changed by the insistence of people of color and their allies, wherever they occur. Allies saying, yep, stop it with just keeping the leaders of the organization as white, and then male, but then maybe we'll include a woman, but a white woman. The insistence to have mentors within organizations to, yes, push through via affirmative action some change to the dynamic of white rule and white dominance. That upsets some people, and then some people just are a little disgruntled about it, and some people act out to the degree that Derek Chauvin is acted out on that day. They form white militias. They intensify bad, aggressive, violent behavior. They try and idealize civil war. They form the Boogaloo movement, which, if you know, is a reference to a movie sequel called Electric Boogaloo 2, The Electric Shuffle, and they're just using a sequel because they're referencing a sequel to the Civil War. So it's just become another way of describing a civil war, a second civil war, as a desired outcome that they support. They wear Hawaiian shirts and they plan to murder law enforcement officers. And law enforcement officers would care more about it in a collective sense, were it not for the fact that these second Civil War people are white supremacists, and that often coincides with the loyalties of some people, many people who have infiltrated various armed forces and police departments, who are baked in white supremacist ideas that it is desirable and good to subjugate people of color, and that you need to uphold a narrative of superiority, and you can't let people achieve. You have to intimidate Black people who think they should have a say in things. You have to, during the Tea Party, to show your opposition to a Black Democratic president because it's so emotionally painful to you. The cognitive dissonance is so powerful when you see a Black man in a position of power and leadership and authority and excellence. So I hope, I should have written some of that down. Let's see. Microcosm. I think the key point from what I just said was that Derek Chauvin's defiance of the crowd is a microcosm for the macrocosm of white supremacist defiance. that they continue to try and make reality be as they want it, as they have already concluded it is. So if they've concluded that Black people are inferior to white people, then they have to try and intimidate Black people out of white spaces. They have to try and continue to, as Derek Chauvin did, to brutalize and humiliate Black people that they encounter in order to set an example, to say, look what happens, look what I'll do to you with impunity because the system has my back. So Derek Chauvin was trying to assert, however subconsciously or consciously, the power of a white supremacist system. Oh, this is gold. I want to see this written down. I want to read this article myself. Damn it, I have a habit of going with a train of thought, which is good. I'm glad to interact with an audience. But this is stuff I want to see read and I want to see disseminated. I want people to discuss how the expression that animated Derek Chauvin's face that day, that smugness and that smirk that people remarked on, everybody talks about it at that individual level, but what it represents at a larger level is someone who trusts in a system with good reason. Maybe it has been written elsewhere and I just haven't come across it and I'm not reading broadly enough. Sean's here. Hi, Sean. Have I started writing it? Yeah, I'm making notes now, but my website, I haven't made a blog post entry. But for people who just tuned in, I was saying that it's not just Derek Chauvin's personality characteristics at play. The defiance he exhibited of the people asking him to show mercy to George Floyd and to not murder him during the course of an arrest, what should be a simple arrest, by not exert force so inappropriately that you deprive a man of the very breath that sustains him. That defiance, that in a child you could almost call it oppositional defiance disorder, somebody who extends what they're doing that's wrong out of a desire to push back against other people's claim to have authority over you. So there's onlookers who said, no, you can't do that. You mustn't do that. Stop killing him. He's like, I'll show you. I will kill him. He killed him and he continued to kneel on his neck for 3 minutes after his death. And that defiance and that acting out, because that prolonged, slow, torturous death is worse than a lot of things that have been captured on camera, which appear to be more impulsive in the heat of the moment. He had so many options to back down from what he was doing, but that commitment in that moment to defy all the onlookers calling for mercy, calling for appropriate professional behavior that safeguards the public rather than jeopardizing the life of a citizen who's being arrested. And you're still a citizen when you're being arrested, even if police culture in your department has fomented the idea of referring to people as perpetrators and dehumanizing them. But that is a microcosm of the defiance of the white protection racket, more broadly speaking, of people who do have a negative reaction to being told what to do, being told to change and to stop doing things that are harmful. So everybody's vibrating now with the resonance of this crossroads that we're at, where there's an invitation on the table saying, change, feel that empathy, lean into that distress you felt when you saw the footage of a man being slowly killed over the course of 9 minutes, whilst pleading and begging and crying for his life, and with others also making it clear that this could not be an accident, could not be said to be done unconsciously. It had to be done consciously because he was being informed every step of the way that he, Officer Chauvin, was placing George Floyd's life in jeopardy. Craig says, good evening, Dav. Sean Nesbitt says his smugness went away when that verdict was read. Yes. And Molly says, hello. So yes, that defiance, that oppositional defiance disorder is manifested in all of the white militias that are currently terrorizing the United States. And I say terrorizing the United States because whilst their targets might be people of color, they are also allies of people of color. And so they target Democrats. They target people who are pro-social because America only has essentially one functional political party at the moment that seeks to enact policies that will help people. And yes, Democrats more strongly emphasize social justice and equality and equity and issues of helping those who are in unfortunate positions and acknowledging some of the history that has produced those conditions of misfortune. And because they have to assert that so strongly in order to counteract the assertions of Republicans that there is no such thing as persistent racism, that the only racism that exists in American society now is racism against white people. And the hoods are coming off a little bit because somebody actually tweeted that yesterday. Matt Walsh tweeted, and I saved it so that I could show you because I thought it was so extraordinary that they would openly say it. But that's a function of the time in that their desperation because they lost the election and Trump fell out of power or was escorted out of power by the votes of strong people, decent people on the Democratic side, the strong operators on the ground who ensured that enough voters had access to the polls, who helped bring about this extraordinary and historic victory for decency and democracy. That's something that the Democrats did whilst the Republican Party continues to try and harm Americans and underplay the reality of the insurrection, the dangers of domestic terrorism through white nationalistic groups, white militias, and the Proud Boys and the accelerationist movements who are even more anti-authority, but also still anti-diversity, anti-inclusion. They still want to kill the government because they resent the impact of big government. Okay, I found the quote that I'm referencing, so I'll just bring it up. I've just got a few bookmarked points of white people really struggling with the verdict. So here is Matt Walsh. He has, let's have a look. He has a lot of followers. He has 524.5 thousand followers. And in his biography, he ironically describes himself as a theocratic fascist and a tyrant. Presumably he's been called that because he is a theocratic fascist. He is a white Christian person who is intent on imposing some of that white Christianity on everybody in America, regardless of their religious affiliations or their skin color. He wants white Christians to be the gatekeepers of all power in the US. And that I feel confident in saying because have a look at this quote from him and tell me how you feel about the degree to which this is untethered from reality, the degree to which this attempts to assert a completely made up, fabricated reality. He says, the only systemic and institutional racism left in America is anti-white racism. Now, that's a very profound statement on his part, profoundly disturbing, but also profoundly revealing. So when Matt Walsh, an influential, popular white Christian blogger, says that the only type of systemic and institutional racism left in America is anti-white, he's actually articulating a statement that is something that bonds together all of the various people and coalitions that voted for Trump. So the fundamentalist Pentecostal Christians and the stock market centrists who might be irreligious but who wanted Trump for the tax cuts. Many of them are animated by a principle that says the only type of racism that exists in America is anti-white. And that denial of history and present, that denial of what has happened to Black Americans, not just through the imposition of slavery, but what people with that enslaving mentality have done to oppose Black success at multiple points across history. The way there has been a whitelash against Black communities, a whitelash against the Reconstruction that occurred after the Civil War was lost by pro-slavery people, and that they then had national troops stationed in southern states to prevent open violence and discrimination against freed Black people. But that ended up, there was a compromise taken after a contentious election, and Republicans had challenged the results of an election, and they were able to advocate for the ending of that occupation by anti-slavery people of the pro-slavery states, i.e. facilitating a resumption of attacks on Black people to punish them for having the audacity to have sought freedom and achieved freedom. Marsha's here and says, hello, Dav. Thank you, Marsha. It is lovely to see you. Molly notes that the right wing is having a meltdown over the Chauvin verdict. I imagine they would, because they're having cognitive dissonance. In their world, white dominance is, you're not supposed to be held accountable for subjugating Black people. That's the natural order of events. So they have a naturalistic fallacy that's being profoundly violated by the legal system in America having this moment of functionality, this moment of incapacity to deny reality, the reality that many Black Americans assert, that many Black Americans are aware of. The thing is, it's not a 100% rule of thumb that you can always use. And people aren't always murdering someone and this is difficult for me to say because I understand that so many people I respect have been very public saying they think police officers should have tased Akilah Bryant, that they should have shot at her legs. They assert that police are trained to shoot for extremities, and that's not true because shooting's difficult. And with a handgun, you don't have a scope. You can't shoot accurately, easily. Police are trained to always shoot for center mass, that being the biggest area. So you're more likely to actually hit someone if you feel the need to dissuade them from killing someone in a moment. Yes. Molly notes that Black Lives Matter isn't anti-white. They're pro-Black American, and they want change to be treated equally. Some white Americans are afraid they'll get equal rights. Yes, and it seems to be such a profound psychological dysfunction that I've often linked it to a sort of Old Testament approach to the world, that they're afraid that once the descendants of enslaved people are free enough to have control over the government, to exercise power in a significant way, that automatically means they will try and oppress white people as an eye for an eye, retributive rebalancing of the scale. And Black people will say, no, that's your neurosis. You imagined that President Barack Obama was trying to inflame racial tensions. He was trying to calm racial tensions. You imagined that he was coming for your guns, and so you bought more guns. And you watched Fox News confirm your worst suspicions that President Barack Obama was trying to diminish the status and the comforts that white Americans enjoy. You've imagined that you are under attack because that's how you conceive of justice. That if the people who were excluded from power for hundreds of years finally gain access to power, that their first impulse will be to revenge themselves on you. And that's neurotic and inaccurate. And Barack Obama bent over backwards to try and help those people dispense with their negative, irrational, neurotic phobias of Black power. Henry Luke points out that the white supremacists always use victimhood and imagined persecution as a recruiting tool. Yes. And Sean points out that what many white Americans fear, and the main problem is when you've been in power for so long, equality feels like oppression. True, and because it is a loss. It's not just a gain by Black people that's being advocated for. If meritocracy actually becomes more actualized in the United States, then there is a loss of something that we don't talk about much, and that's white nepotism. Nepotism, strictly speaking, means favorable preferential deals for your family members, employing your Ivanka Trump to work in the White House, employing your son-in-law Jared Kushner to be in charge of Middle East peace. That's nepotism. That's people who you're favoring not because of their qualifications, but because of your familial prejudices in their favor. And despite the fact that you should know better, that people will tell you, don't hire your children. If you're in a publicly elected position, do not impose on taxpayers in that way to employ your children. You should be analyzing people who are the best candidates and the best fit for the job. And it's only going to be your base or your most personality cult devotees that say, yes, no, I'm sure your offspring and their partners are the best people for the job. Of course that's true, because your loins are golden and you are like a king. Yes. Craig has to go because his phone is dead. See you, Craig. Thanks for joining in. There's white nepotism in business. There's white nepotism in corporations. And I can find a study to illustrate that to people. Workplace psychology study. Resumes disregarded. Oh, no, that's a study from 2004. Okay, we'll do a study from 2004 and one from 2017. There's a lot of studies. So in 2004, some researchers studied race in the labor market by sending fictitious resumes to help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers. To manipulate perceived race, resumes were randomly assigned with African American or white-sounding names. White names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. Callbacks are also more responsive to resume quality for white names than for African American names. The racial gap is uniform across occupation, industry, and employer size. We also find little evidence that employers are inferring social class from the names. Differential treatment by race appears to still be prominent in the US labor market. So that was a study from 2004. I'm going to now look at something from 2017. Minorities who whiten job resumes get more interviews. I tell you what, I'll bring it up on screen so you can see as well. African American and African American and Asian job applicants who mask their race on resumes seem to have better success getting job interviews. They're whiting their resumes by deleting references to their race with the hope of boosting their shot at jobs, and research shows the strategy is paying off. This is a publication from Harvard Business School. The research findings should, in fact, companies are more than twice as likely to call minority applicants for interviews if they submit whitened resumes than candidates who reveal their race. And this discriminatory practice is just as strong for businesses that claim to value diversity as those that don't. These research findings should provide a startling wake-up call for business executives. A bias against minorities runs rampant through the resume screening process at companies throughout the United States, says Catherine A. DeSells, the visiting associate professor of business administration at Harvard Law School. So, yep, that was a study from 2016. They created resumes for Black and Asian applicants and sent them out. Some of the resumes included information that clearly pointed out the applicant's minority status, while others were whitened or scrubbed of racial clues. Oh, look, we've got a little graph. Percentage of resumes that earned, I'm going to take a photo of this so I can post it to Twitter. So the whitened resumes have earned requests for interviews. 25% if you whiten your resume, and 10% if your resume contains racial cues. And there you go. Similarly, but to a lesser extent slightly lesser extent with Asian applicants. But yes, even pro-diversity employers still discriminate. That's extraordinary, that even people who ostensibly are committed to being pro-diversity. One Black student explained in an interview that with each resume she sent out, she weighed whether or not to include her involvement in a Black student organization. If the employer is known for trying to employ more people of color and having a diversity outreach program, then I would include it, because in that sense, they're trying to broaden their employees. But if they're not actively trying to reach out to people of other races, then no, I wouldn't include it. But it turns out she's making a mistake in either case. If you want to maximize your chances of getting a callback for an interview, even with pro-diversity employers, it seems. This is a major point of our research, that you are at an even greater risk for discrimination when applying with a pro-diversity employer, because then you're being more likely to be transparent. These companies have the same rate of discrimination, which makes you more vulnerable when you expose yourself to those companies. Yeah. The researcher says, I don't think it's intended to be a setup. She says, these organizations are not necessarily all talk when they say they're pro-diversity. Maybe the diversity values are there, but they just haven't been translated from the person who writes the job ad to the person who is screening resumes. I.e., it's very important, if you're an employer who values diversity, to make sure that the people screening your resumes are not acting as white gatekeepers, as gatekeepers of white privilege and preference and white dominance. So that was interesting to read about from me. Marsha notes that her grandfather changed his last name when his mother applied to college. He was afraid she wouldn't get in as a Jew. And I'm sure there was a lot of gatekeeping to exclude Jewish people from universities. Absolutely, I've heard about that before. I think I'm going to go have lunch in a minute, but I'm going to watch Tucker Carlson be crazy. And before that, also, I found the person who had this good idea about how we should act to help people who are stuck. Not necessarily because we want to help them. I'm talking about people stuck in an alternate, a fabricated conservative reality. Oops, wrong one. His name is Eric Blair, and it's such a good idea. He suggests that we talk to people about Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch and why they put lies and distortions on air to trick people like your friends into voting for tax cuts for billionaires. So he was responding to someone who said his life became much less complicated and stressful after he removed all Fox News and business disinformation channels from his guide listing. When friends begin to quote Fox, I interrupt and say, I never believe an entertainment channel. Stops the conversation cold. So that is one good way to stop a conversation in which somebody is trying to air their Fox fabricated talking points. But the idea of where to take it further from that, once you've stopped them, if you have the chance or you think it would be fruitful, to at least try and give them a story. To remember that people don't incorporate new facts unless they have a scaffold of a story that they find plausible. A plausible story. And it is a plausible story, and there's lots of evidence in the real world that, yes, billionaires are manipulating politics. So that they may already accept that as a truth, which may be the spoonful of sugar to help the real story be more plausible to them, that Rupert Murdoch and his son, who own Fox News, they run Tucker Carlson's show at a loss, relatively speaking, with advertisers because it helps them get political power. It helps them have a finger in the pie of American democracy, more than a finger, a whole fist in the pie of American democracy, so that, yep, Trump in power and the Republicans pushed through tax cuts, and that was primarily what they did. And they expect people to be happy with the crumbs of saying, look how terrible Democrats are. Look at this culture war crumb, and we'll give you a win on that one. And look, now we're writing laws against transgender kids in schools, and that should work as a crumb for you because remember how you're defending the fabric of society from those fluid gender people that we help you laugh at and feel superior to. So we are forming a powerful association in the minds of our Fox audience that if you're straight and have gender confidence, or have never felt tempted to present yourself in a different way to the gender you were plausibly at birth, then you can legally look forward to legally subjugating people who don't share that same one-dimensional gender nature. They feel that they want to be a different gender or want to present as a different gender, and if you can't relate to them, good. You don't just have to not relate to them. You can actively despise them. You can actively construct an identity, a sense of superiority on the basis of despising others. That's how fascism works. It gets people addicted to a moral clarity achieved through condemning and despising others. That's a good sentence. And it is. That's how fascism has always worked. Getting a critical mass of people, doesn't have to be everybody in a society, but a critical mass of people, of voters, addicted to the moral clarity of condemning, did I say condemning, and despising others, despising a group of people. So you pick low-hanging fruit that people maybe there was pre-existing relatively high levels of contempt for. If it's Jewish people and there's a high level of anti-Jewish sentiment, as there was in multiple European countries for various centuries, and you just build on that and you amplify that. In America, it was an irrational tendency to denigrate the migrants who are often the target of, or often the target of lies that the government gives them phones and houses and cars, and that there's all of this social safety net that's specially magically available to undocumented people, and that they're somehow ripping off Americans. I'm not an open borders advocate, but it's not true that undocumented migrants don't pay tax. It's not. Undocumented migrants prop up a lot of industries that haven't worked out how to function yet without paying people very poor wages. Or they haven't, a lot of agricultural businesses that are sustained by the exploitational labor of undocumented migrants. Sean notes that our family changed our family name because as Jewish farmers, we couldn't do business. It worked after a while. Sean, just let me say how happy I was to get your message the other day when, first of all, you said during the broadcast that you would help. You wanted to volunteer your involvement in some way, shape or form if I run for office once I settle into the US, and that when I'm settled to contact you. And I was so excited about that. And it really helped me deal with some of the negative feelings I have about moving to the States, because I'm fearful of gun violence and I'm fearful of psychological trauma for my children if they have to participate in gun drills. So I think Molly noted that because Massachusetts has relatively strict gun laws, the schools might be less likely to have regular gun drills, active shooter drills where you have to hide and pretend that there's somebody hunting you with a lethal weapon. But I also did have a really hard time processing the other comment Molly made as well, I think, which was that a teacher had said, pack a change of clothes for school children prior to the first active shooter drill held during school time, because children frequently wet themselves with fear. And thank you. I'm so glad you brought that to my attention, because that is an important point for me to consider when looking at schools and trying to find a safe place for my children to attend when we move, and was even causing me to be an advocate for my husband trying to rapidly look for a different job in a different country, because I'm Australian and I don't live in Australia right now, but I don't live in the US either. And it's, as a responsible parent, I have to consider what risks I'm exposing my children to. And I think talking about that to Americans is important as well, because to know that you don't have to accept those levels of risk. And it's frustrating to know that so little action has been taken over the years, and that positive actions, like, was it the Brady Act, the one that Joe Biden was involved with, that helped ban semi-automatic weapons for a time, during which time homicide fell by 43%. But then the ban expired, or was allowed to expire, and gun violence rose dramatically, and homicide rates rose and suicide rates rose. So I imagine that we should look to civil rights activists for inspiration, because that battle would have seemed unwinnable and disconcerting to have to fight for your humanity, to have to fight for acknowledgement that you are not a second-tier citizen and you should not be treated as less than human, that you should have free and fair access to voting rights, that you should participate in exercise of political power along with your fellow taxpayers. Your friend did find a school that didn't have the drills. She goes to a school at the Jewish Community Center. Interesting. So it's possible. And Marsha notes that Sean, for some reason, she can't reply directly to you, but that's what happened in her family with their names as well. It's so funny, even when I don't know, when it's not obvious, that my audience is or my vocal audience is often composed of people who are Jewish who relate to what I'm saying. But I'm proud to know that Jewish people have persevered through these struggles of exclusion, and that Jewish people have often been allies of people in the civil rights movements in the US, to be advocates for not stigmatizing and subjugating Black people to a lesser status, to say out loud the truth, the story that is understood and known by Black Americans of their oppression at the hands of white people and institutions that have catered to the interests of white people, that have perpetuated white dominance in the labor market and in home ownership, that have ensured that the benefits afforded to returning soldiers have only been afforded to returning white soldiers from World War II, that the GI benefits package was denied to soldiers of color who nevertheless similarly put their lives on the line for service to their country and their country's interests during World War II. And that these are stories that need to be known, because without them, you cannot have empathy, you cannot have a full understanding of what needs to be done. You need to know what has been done in order to know what needs to be done and what needs to be addressed and what needs to be improved. The white protection racket is often a status quo preservation racket. And to my mind, that's an important insight, because it helps explain why you sometimes get Black people who join the Republican Party. They're people who feel troubled by the kind of complaining you need to do to get change. They don't want to complain, they want to get on with things, and they'll say, we don't like that victimhood culture, or we believe that Democrats are oppressing Black people by feeding a story of how Black people have been victimized. We don't enjoy the sensation of feeling that our ancestors have been victimized. We don't want to be victims, therefore we don't want to talk about having ever been victims. And we don't want to even acknowledge or look at the ways in which that victimization is continuing. So you do get people of color and people from minority groups who embrace the Republican Party out of this misguided idea that they will help people and that they are pro-business, because they are pro-corporate, but Republicanism is so fascist leaning at the moment that is destabilizing for a country. So we need to maybe know that the people who have peeled away from the Republican Party are people who've been capable of recognizing the truth that Trump destabilized the US. We need to talk about how Democratic leadership is a haven for responsible voters who appreciate that business flourishes better in conditions of stability, where you're not trying to rip society apart and set everyone at each other's throats and fail to have a responsible pandemic response. So that's why Donald Trump lost, because of some crossover from Republicans to the Democratic Party to vote for Joe Biden, and some flourishing of the Black vote because of the energy afforded to Black organizers who could see the clear and present danger that Trumpism and Republicanism afforded to Black people, that it was jeopardizing everybody's lives, that I'm sure it's more than 1 in 800 Black Americans died during COVID so far because of the way they were disproportionately affected through being disproportionately represented in essential service professions and disproportionately represented in the ranks of people without access to adequate medical care, and then disproportionately represented in the ranks of people receiving inadequate medical care within the establishment, because there is still some unconscious anti-Black bias amongst medical professionals who fail to exercise appropriate levels of care and concern towards Black people who are sick. Again, it's a story that many Black people are aware of, the truth of that statement. and it's not 100% true, it's a statistical likelihood that increases for Black people. So many people die each year in the US because of medical error. But dying of medical neglect, disproportionately Black Americans. Marsha notes that there are Jewish schools which are not orthodox to go to, and that Jews have played a very important role in civil rights and continue to do so. Yes, I did see a meme put out by a neo-Nazi who had identified all of the Jewish people in media organizations, and they'd grouped them to say, look, these are the headshots of forward public-facing people in CNN and in the New York Times and in Fox. And they marked people with a star if they were Jewish, a blue star. And they marked them with a red star if they were merely married to a Jewish person. And they marked them with a light blue star if their Jewishness was in question, if maybe they are Jewish. There's a suspicion. And that was very full on to look at. There was like a lot of people represented in this big poster meme of, you could zoom in and see all these different faces, some of whom I recognized. And it might not have all been true. Perhaps some of the people they asserted Jewish were not Jewish, but that's not the point. The point is that this meme was trying to cultivate and amplify and build on pre-existing levels of hatred for and suspicion of Jewish people. I guess you start with the suspicion. You start with alarming people to go, oh, gosh, that's a lot of Jews in the news, in the media. Because yes, Jewish people often gravitate towards significant intellectual jobs. We're culturally indoctrinated to do so as a consequence of having been persecuted in various countries across time. Which is a function, perhaps, of having been part of a culture that discovered one of the keys to human achievement, which is to feel special, to feel driven by a mission statement to achieve for the good of the people. Because that's what the Jewish religion aims to do, I think, in many respects, is to cultivate a sense of what do we owe to each other. We have to stand up for goodness. So Jews are told, you're special, God chose you to work for the benefit of others. The only trouble is, and I don't want to victim blame, so I think I should watch myself, but I want to say there's some problems with putting your hand up and identifying yourself as special, and then saying we're going to have kosher rules, dietary rules, and other religious rules that promote mixing only with people from inside this community, inside this religion. So don't eat with the other people because you've got to be observant to those rules. So lots of Judaism isn't like that anymore, and probably the bulk of Jews in America are not Orthodox Jews and can eat with anybody and don't really obey. Many people don't obey kosher rules or not strict kosher rules. And we try to work for the good of humanity and not just to elevate the good of the in-group. But it's been those things that kept those original religious rules that kept Jewish people as a strong tribe also sometimes helped to earmark that tribe for persecution. So if a famine happens or if there's disease in medieval Europe and in the Dark Ages, it was easy for ignorant, fearful people to point to the outgroup and use their most base tribal instincts to say, outgroup, they're bad, they're causing the problems. They're probably eating our babies in secret and drinking their blood. They're persecuting Christians. And that foundational story of Jesus, who was Jewish, was somehow persecuted by Jews. That founding story and the persuasiveness of that story conscripts people to participating in this mass victimization of and persecution of Jews. What's my big point with this thing? Look, my audience has lots of Jews. but we are all interested in advancing democracy, and we're all interested in protecting America from the ravages of fascism. Fascism, which uses emotional manipulation to get a critical mass of people and voters addicted to the seeming moral clarity. I think the word seeming is important there. To the seeming moral clarity of condemning and despising a group of people, or many groups of people. Despise and condemn trans kids or trans adults, and then you can condemn trans kids by association and say it's a threat to society. They're trying to force us to use different pronouns. They're trying to force us to change and be more inclusive. They're destabilizing our hierarchy. Destabilizing our hierarchy and our system of preferencing people. Oh, that sounds Hebrew. Tikkun olam, fix the world. See, I should know this as a Jewish person. I'm a very undereducated in a Jewish sense of the word. But that sounds like a Jewish prerogative that I subscribe to, and that clearly lots of Jews in public life also subscribe to. Marsha finished reading On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. Ooh, that would be an important book. I have the little version, which I used to dip into. I bought at an airport and used to dip into whilst reading, looking for ways to help advocate against Trumpism. Now that Trump's not really the high-profile leader anymore, I have to find some other word to describe it, really. Okay, so the Washington Post had an article about a family struggling with truth and trust in a country divided by disinformation. At least that's good that they're admitting the country's divided by disinformation and not just saying the country's divided. Oh no, it's not just divided. It's purposely, willfully being divided by people on the right who are lying to their audience about what's happening in the US, who are using selective reporting, and some even in the mainstream media do this as well. They won't acknowledge that the very selection of stories to report on, the selection of stories to foreground, like Hillary Clinton's emails, like the alleged crisis at the border, that is a function of choosing to cater to Republican viewpoints. And so, yes, whilst it is also true that there is the far left that tend to be very dysfunctional in wanting to overthrow capitalism and burn society down to the ground, they are people who are also addicted to the moral clarity of condemning others and other groups. Only the group they condemn is very broad. It's capitalism. It's society. So they're less of a threat, less of an active threat than white supremacist militias, but they're still perceived as a very significant threat, particularly by conservative media, who are all like, Antifa's coming to get you. Tucker Carlson apparently told his audience that because of the outcome of the Derek Chauvin trial, that hardworking people are going to all be trying to leave the United States, i.e. he's telling retirees who watch Fox News that their Social Security benefits are going to be in jeopardy because the wage earners who pay into government coffers that allow for the payment of Medicare and etc., that's going to be in jeopardy because of wage earning people and income generating people leaving the States to move to another country where they don't persecute their murderous police officers by convicting them and finding them guilty of murder when it's readily apparent that they committed murder in public. So that's how Tucker Carlson is really the new Trump level threat to the United States, to stability and societal harmony. And we have to become more effective in how we oppose him, and we have to become more resolved. We're used to preserving our resolve to evict politicians from office, but we need to evict Fox. We need to evict Tucker Carlson predominantly because his rhetoric has ratcheted up. I think I drove away a listener because she used to donate to my Patreon and say that she just had to stop listening to me if I played a clip from Fox News because it was her resolve to never pay attention to that. But withdrawing our attention from them is not harming that ecosystem. They run it at a loss. It doesn't even matter if decent people don't pay attention. They have a fertile ground for sowing seeds of fascist thinking and fascist rhetoric amongst Americans who have a television and who are retired, who suddenly will have an injury and have to stay home. If they turn on Fox, they are getting daily injections of brain poison that don't just cause them to become alienated from their family, but cause them to become more willing to be violent in the cause of preserving white dominant democracy, white dominant governance from the social ills of Democrats, the Democratic Party, and Black allies, and people who are prepared to protest in the streets against police officers who brazenly murder civilians in broad daylight, but specifically disproportionately Black citizens. Because numerically speaking, it's still predominantly white people, because white people are still the ethnic majority in the US. So when police kill people, they're still killing white people. But because of the injustice of the way in which Black people are disproportionately killed over and above the numbers that should exist if you just were equally persecuting people. I mean, really, we should strengthen our Black allyship, because ultimately the goal should be for police not to kill people in the course of arresting them, not to kill people because they've been conditioned to respond violently to lack of compliance, or they've been conditioned to respond too hastily to perceived threats. And part of that conditioning is a function of Republican insistence to obstruct gun safety legislation, Republican insistence to withhold safety from Americans by opposing the passing of legislation that would safeguard Americans, that would increase red flag laws, that would increase the enforcement of background checks, that would close loopholes whereby guns can be purchased without any safety checks being conducted, any background checks being conducted at gun shows. And yes. So what are the words I'm promoting today? Words of the day are phrases of the day. I could put these on my blog. That makes for easy writing that I can be motivated to do. Phrases of the day and articles of the day. And then that way I have a daily resource linked to my daily broadcasts. Anybody up for that? Go and encourage me. You know I need it. I'm motivated to broadcast every day, but I have to summon additional strength and discipline within myself. Of course, to channel my mother, some of the best things she ever told me came from a movie called Chariots of Fire about British people running in races, including a Jewish person who fought past discrimination and being stigmatized for being Jewish to be a very successful medal-winning runner. And in a Scottish accent, they say in that movie, one character says, "It comes from within, laddie. It comes from within." Yay, Marsha and Knowledge El Shabazz says it sounds good. Okay, phrases of the day. Republicans, or just elected officials withholding safety. Okay, and also obstructing obstructing safety and emotionally terrorizing. Because they're emotionally terrorizing police officers. That was the point I was trying to get to say part of the impulsive way in which officers act in the US, the way they sometimes shoot to kill when there could be alternatives, or they shoot to kill because they have misjudged what's in somebody's hand. Philando Castile was told to produce ID, so he was reaching for his wallet. He was shot, and he was black. Daniel Shaver was reaching to pull up his loose boxer shorts because he was instructed to crawl across the floor to police officers, and his pants were falling down, and he was drunk. He was a white man, and he was shot to death. Police were being overly hasty in their response in a way that was murderous and negligent. And that officer was found not guilty and then rehired by the police force so he could then retire on medical grounds and receive a pension after shooting somebody who was crying and crawling towards him and had begged, please don't shoot me. Molly says, do it, Dav. Yay. Good encouragement, guys. Thank you. I'm going to come to the US and run for office at some point. That's the plan. But also do my part to keep encouraging people who are doing the right thing, to keep retweeting and supporting Stacey Abrams, who lights the path for many Americans. She's familiarized herself with the ways in which Republicans are obstructing democracy. And I can do that. I can share that with you as well because I've got that in my bookmarks. I haven't mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene much, but she announced she was going to have 14. She was going to read all 14 pages of the Green New Deal proposal. This is the best news in the US today. Apparently, Michigan cases are sharply dropping. And people were trying to speculate on why that might be. Oh, no, I'll take myself out of the picture so you can see. There. So you had a peak in November and Christmas, and then another little peak in January. I wonder if that's a post-New Year spike. And this rise, even before Thanksgiving, that's probably also due in a way to all the political rallies that Trump was holding, I wonder. And then Michigan rising recently and falling. Now, I want to remind everybody that Republicans voted to strip Governor Whitmer of her executive powers so that she stopped being able to compel compliance with mitigation strategies against COVID, such as mask wearing, social distancing, and temporary closing of things like restaurants and worship, indoor worship. Marsha says, we want you here. I'm in New York, but I will help your campaign. That's how people do it, isn't it? That's how people come to power, because ideas sell themselves. And if you try and get good ideas and you want to use those ideas to achieve progress, as well as conserving what is good, maintaining the status quo insofar as it's good, and reassuring people that you don't intend to sabotage the positive elements of the status quo. You won't just throw the baby out with the bathwater for nothing. I think that's what a lot of Republican voters are attracted to, a promise of not changing. Which is why it's so important to be honest about the status quo. It's so important to be honest about your history as a nation, not to just say America's terrible and get a dopamine high off seeming moral clarity of condemning people. Oh, terrible modern society, terrible capitalism. That's what a lot of people on the far left are addicted to, and it doesn't help them get anywhere politically, because whilst it's very addictive and you can form groups around it, you can form little socialist groups, you can't have a media machine support you because it doesn't have corporate backing so much. It might a little bit if there are some corporate interests that want to attack other corporate interests. So Silicon Valley bros wanting to sabotage Amazon or something like that, then yes, you might get a bit of corporate backing. Or if Republicans are surreptitiously funding socialists so that they can point to socialists and say, look at the socialists growing in power, quick, vote for Republicans to defeat the socialists, then yes, that I'm sure also happens as well. Knowledge El Shabazz says, I have your vote. That's what you need for political power, isn't it? People to vote for you. And you need people with the capacity to learn and grow, and not just to listen to others and get pulled in all directions trying to please everybody, but the capacity to learn to learn a story that fits the truth as much as possible. Communism excludes an important truth. Communism denies that humans flourish when they're allowed to compete with each other, because communism so foregrounds justice and equality that it ends up being very unjust and very unequal. And it promotes a centralized bureaucracy that just facilitates massive nepotism, as well as murderous neglect towards millions of people. That's the problem with communism. And I can speak to that. I can speak to that fear that lots of Americans clearly have, because that fear is encouraged and amplified by Fox, by conservative media engines. But I can also speak to the fear other people have of being betrayed by insufficient government activity. People who understand that America has been held hostage for so long by people who've tried to inculcate fear of big government purely because they didn't want to lose out on white privilege protection rackets because of the success of civil rights activists. They feared that when women pushed for equality and Black Americans pushed for equality, that would mean an end to various cozy, under-examined relationships that gave them access to wonderful benefits. Friendly, I took notes as I wrote. That's an important point. Damn it. If anybody ever feels like listening back to a broadcast like this and taking any form of notes and then using my Twitter direct messages or my email address to send it to me, I would be indebted to you. But that's okay. I know I'm not special. I'm not the only person trying to think about these topics. So even though I would love to get it written down, I know if I keep looking, I'll find other places where these things are written down as well. One of my favorite journalists is Greg Sargent. He writes for the Washington Post, and he's often pretty clear. And my other favorite sources of information are women. What's my favorite historian called? Heather Cox Richardson, I think. And I'm on her mailing list, and she teaches me so much about contributing patterns. I'll have to promote her on my blog as well. I'm a tiny fish. She's very influential and broadly read, but whatever. I throw a pebble into the water, I'm contributing to the waves that help keep America afloat. Damn it. I forgot to take location off, and it had it the whole time. But whatever, not going to be here for much longer. We're moving to the US. So I'll say thank you, everybody, for today. Take care and have a great evening. Bye, everyone.